Andrea Grandi.
Oh.
We talk about getting started with requests, HTTP library. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you. So, as announced, the talk is going to be on request library. It's a really base level, so don't expect anything too advanced because it's not going to be the case. So, first, a brief introduction on myself. I'm Andrea, I live in London, work in London actually. I work for the government, I'm a Python Django developer, and I'm also passionate about microcontrollers, Arduino, Golang lately, and mobile development. Well, but let's start talking about the library itself. Before digging into the explanation of the library, a very brief introduction about what is an HTTP request. So in case there is some developer here who has not worked with web development, let's explain what is it. An HTTP request is basically when you want to interact through an action with a remote service. We see this example, the web client wants to perform a login on the web server. Performing a login usually involves you to use the post action. With the post action, you are sending some data. So here we see that with the post action on a specific URL, we are sending username and password that are UMP parameters. When this is done, the web server receives the request, process it, does some calculation, like in this case, like verifying if the username and password are correct. If they are, the server replies with an HTTP response. That in this case is 200, that means the response is okay, so you have performed a successful action on the remote server. So that's it, very briefly. What is request? Request is a Python library that is used to do all these actions. So instead of manually interacting with the HTTP protocol, you're using this library to perform the most common actions. It supports Python 2.6 on, so 2.6, 2.7, and also 3.6. I'm sorry if I haven't updated the slides, but 3.6 is definitely supported because I'm using it live for a project. It's used by large companies in the world, so it's used by, well, UK government, for example, is used by Google, Twilio, Mozilla, Roku, so all these companies are using this library. This should give you quite an assurance about the quality of the library itself. Don't worry about digging into a library that is not maintained, because this is not the case. It's very actively maintained. It was originally written by Kenneth Wright, and now it's just like the maintainer of the core, but there are more core developers, so it's not just a one-man library. It has a very active community, and it's really easy to use. Plus, you surely recognize the philosophy behind the library. It's basically the Zen of Python. So to explain briefly what's the philosophy of this library, if you're doing something in the most simple way, you're doing it correctly. If you're using a complex way to implement something, you're doing it wrong. And that's basically what's behind the philosophy of Python. Because the readability counts. So that's very important, and you have to make things easier, either to write and to read later, especially if other people are working on the same code base. You may wonder, why not urlib2? urlib2 is shipped by default with Python, so why not using the library? Okay, let's see an example. So I will show you how to interact with the GitHub API, and first with urlib2, and then with request library. So this is the code. I hope the code is readable. Yeah. This is the example using urlib2. So you can see by yourself. You need to import the library. You need to define a URL. There is a bit complicated method for performing the authentication. Then you have to create like an opener object. Then you have to install this opener. You need an handler, and then you can finally get a response back. Well, to be honest, if I had to write this code again, without looking at the slide, I will not be able to do it, to be honest. There may be someone else who is very expert about this library and can do right things, but I would not be able. Let's see the same example with request. That's it. You import the library, you use the get method on the library itself. You just pass the URL and the parameters for the authentication, and you don't have to do anything else. The R object, in this case, contains the response. You can immediately investigate what's the status code, what's the headers, and whatever you may need to read. So let's see how to make other more complex requests, even if I mention that they're not going to be too complex. We have seen the request, we have seen the get. The most simple one is the one without parameters, except for the URL, of course, because you need to specify what you want to read. Then here we can see a get using parameters. You may have seen, especially when you browse some website, you have like a question mark, and then there are a lot of parameters. When you send a GET request, you normally have to encode these parameters properly. With request, you don't have to do it manually. You just define all the values in a dictionary, and you pass the dictionary to the params. If you're passing the params to a GET, all the parameters are being encoded automatically, and the URL is being constructed with all the query string. So that's less work to do, and easier to read, and even easier to change later in case you want to change some parameter. A post follows exactly the same usage. The only difference, in case you're using a post, you have to pass the payload to the data parameter. Everything else is unchanged. Just the post.post parameter on the request library. This is an example about how to encode JSON. For example, I often use this library to interact with external API. External API usually expect you to send a request in JSON format. How to do that with request? Simple. You define another dictionary and you pass to the JSON parameter. The payload is automatically encoded to JSON string, so you don't have to worry about double quoting everything, because otherwise, for example, if you use a single quote, it's not going to be valid JSON, etc. So you just pass to the JSON parameter and you're done. You don't have to do anything else. Of course, you can specify custom headers. Well, I've used this very, very common example in case you want to customize your user agent. Coming back to to one of the slides I was seeing before, Django's framework was mentioned. With Django's framework, when you want to perform authentication, the most simple method is use an authentication token. So you may want to change the user agent to authorization, and then you pass the token here, and you don't have to do anything else because that request is going to be authenticated for Django's framework usage. So, find the two thoughts. So custom headers, there are of course other methods that are supported. Don't worry if you haven't used these at all or if you haven't seen before, that's not a problem. Usually the most common are get and post, but these are very used especially if you interact with REST APIs. So put, patch, head, options and delete are supported. So don't worry, everything is covered. Requests can be used for any kind of REST interaction. All right, so we have talked until now about requests. When you perform a request, you know, the server, assuming there is no timeout connection or networking problem, you're going to receive a response back. So let's see what kind of response you receive back and how to read this response. Again, it's very simple. For example, the status code that allow you to check if the response was successful or not. In this case, 200 is successful. You know, 201 means that a resource has been created, and so on. How to check if the response was correct? You just check the status code. You can also use constant. The example I've just mentioned. You may want to check if if the response is 200 or 201. But if you use the constant, they are the same thing, so you don't have to make a long line with if and. No, you don't need that. You just need to check if the request code is okay. Right. Oh, this is a very useful thing. In case you receive a bad response, so in this case a 404, the resource is not existent, you can use the raise for status command that basically does this. If the response is okay, it does nothing. So you just proceed with your source code execution. Otherwise, if there is an exception, if there is a bad response, it will raise an exception. So please remember to try accept your code. Otherwise, it's gonna crash. And the kind of exception you're gonna get back is HTTP error with, of course, the message that you get from the server. Right. We have seen before how to perform a JSON encoding. In a very simple way, you can perform the JSON decoding. So when you receive in the response a JSON string, just invoking the .json method on the response gives you back a Python dictionary that you can immediately use in your code. So you don't need to use the JSON library, use like JSON.loads. You don't have to do that. It's done automatically by the .json method. It's very useful to have. Of course, you can inspect headers. Sometimes in the headers, you may have information about the resource you have created. For example, I'm using for one of my projects a service called Toshel. Toshel, when you create a resource on the server, you don't get back a payload, a JSON payload with all the resource that has been created, all the resource information. You get back this in the header. So you will get a URL, like a resource location, and you have to inspect the header. So it's very useful in my case, but I think there are also other APIs that work in the same way. It's very useful to have this feature. One thing to keep in mind is that you can access this using any casing. So content type can be all uppercase or all lowercase, but it's going to be the same. So no problem. Cookies. Cookies are very important, especially if you're dealing with a web request. Are of course supported. So when you perform a request on a URL, if the server returns you back a cookie, you can inspect that from the cookies dictionary. Sessions. Sessions are also very important. We have seen before how to perform an authentication. You don't want to perform the authentication on each request. So if you use a session to do your get, your post, whatever, especially if the server returns you a token, you may want to reuse the same session object to perform the following request. So you will be automatically authenticated for all the requests. So that's quite nice to have. Right, go on. Timeout. Timeout. When you interact, especially with an external resource, you cannot know in advance if the resource is going to be fast or is going to be, or you can give a timeout. So it's important that your code doesn't crash and can handle this kind of behavior. So you can set just simple timeout parameters. This works for get, post, delete, whatever. Every command that is supported by request supports the timeout. In this case, I set a very low timeout, like 0.001 seconds, because I want it to fail. And you will get back a timeout exception. So just know it. Right. We have seen, I'm not going to go too much in detail on this one because it's considered an advanced topic, but I just want you to know that multiple requests are not supported in the basic library. You may want to use gRequest, that is basically an add-on for this library and is being developed by the same author, Kenneth Wright. And there are also other two third-party implementation, fRequest and request futures. Let's see a very simple example with the gRequest. With gRequest, you just import the library. You define, for example, a couple of URLs. Then you map this URL in the request. And then you finally execute the map. The map thing basically will execute all the gets on all the URL that are defined in the that have been defined before, and you will get back a list of responses. So, in case you have the necessity to perform multiple requests at the same time and wait back for the responses, this is the library you can use. I also want to spend. Okay, so error exception. I will go later on a very important topic. Errors and exception, these are all the kind of exception you can get back from a response. You may have a connection error. Connection error is the basic case when, for example, your Wi-Fi is disconnected, there is a network problem, whatever, you're gonna get a connection error. HTTP error is the kind of exception returned by raise for status. So in case you use the raise for status on a request, you're going to get back an HTTP error. Timeout, we have just seen it. Timeout is when you set the timeout parameter, for example, 1 second. The response is taking 2 seconds. Even if it's still a valid response, it doesn't matter, you will get a timeout exception. Last, too many redirects. Sometimes there is a redirection implemented in the resource you're getting. In case there are too many redirection, this is like a support thing, so you will be notified that there are too many redirects. And so basically your code is not stuck in a loop where it's never getting back the response. So this is a topic that is really important, at least for me, testing. I'm not going to go too much in detail about unit testing. There has been a very interesting talk at the beginning from Ellie. If you haven't seen, I suggest you to watch it when it's going live. But I just want to explain how to do testing for the request library. Basically, there are two couple of methods. We will see both. So first, let's see an implementation of a method. So we have a get example. In this case, we are calling an external URL, and we are returning back the JSON returned by this URL. By the way, just want to talk about this. HTTP bin is not a fake URL. It's an existing URL. Is a live service that you can use to live test your clients. So in this case, you can do a real get. You can test a real post. There are also predefined URL that return you back an error. So you can test if your library is working correctly because you're interacting with the real service. Well, in this case, we are just returning a JSON. How do we want to test this? When you test a method, okay, now this is very simple, but imagine you are doing plenty of other things. The point of this is that you don't want to interact with an external resource. So the code that you want to test has to be local. So what we need is to simulate the fact that we are doing the call and the fact that we are getting back a response. So how to do that? How to get back some data without interacting with the external resource? Well, you can use mock, that I think has been covered this morning in Alex's talk. As you can see, you have to patch the method that is going to be used. So in our case, we're using request.get. The mock request must be, the mock request basically later has to be assigned the return value that we create before, that is mocked response. So we create a mock object, we set the status code we want, we set an expected dictionary that is the return value of the JSON method. It works. I've used it plenty of times. It's just a little bit too complicated for this specific library. There is another library, another testing library, that makes this more simple. And it's called responses. In responses, you just use the decorator, responses activate, and you add something to this object. So you have the kind of request that you're going to do and the URL. The rest is just the body, so the response, the data that you want to return, and the status. That's it. Please make sure that the kind of request and the URL are matching with what your code is doing. So you're doing a get on that URL. If, for example, we did a get here on HTTP without S, so without using TLS, and here we are defining HTTPS URL, the thing is not going to work, so your code, instead of using responses, is going to really hit the real service. So I tell you this, stress you enough with this, because it's a very common mistake I've done a lot of times. So when something is not working properly, check that you have matched this correctly. That's pretty much. I want just to show you the code for this. You can have this code and this test. It's on my GitHub in case you want to play with the code. It's not fake code, it's really working code. I'm using PyTest, and you can see that it's really working code. In case something is still not working, you can contact me on this. Find me on Twitter, GitHub, by email. You can send me an encrypted email, whatever. And that's all. I think there is just, okay, references. I suggest you to have a look at the official documentation for request, because this was an introductory talk, but you may want to see more advanced features about this library. And the source code that I've just mentioned is available on my GitHub. Thank you.
Thank you. There is any question? Questions?
Oh, they're all starving for the coffee break. Oh, there is one.
Hello, thank you for your talk. There is a way to mock at the same time different aliases for the same URL. For example, the same website with the different.
As far as I know, not with responses. It's easier to do with mock, because mock is basically catching all the calls that you are doing to the .get method. So sometimes it's difficult, the opposite thing. You're doing multiple gets and you want to have different responses. You can still do that. You can define, I think you've seen like a list of responses with mock. So if you call multiple times, the first time you get the first response, the second time you get the second response. With with responses is not possible. It has, of course, advantages because it's easier to use, but if you are in a more complex situation and you want to mock more things, it's not going to be useful. It's best to use mock.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Hi. Do requests and responses play well with URLs not using Roman characters? You know, Unicode characters in URL?
I think, but I will double check. I think that Unicode is fully supported because I've heard about other projects using it at least in India. So I don't think they're using exactly our code set, so they're using a different one. And if it works for them, I think that also, if it basically supports Unicode, also, for example, a URL written in Chinese characters can work.
Yes, but just to be sure, I am talking about the URL string, not
All right,
not the
matching.
page, not the page content. So
Your string, yeah, I can tell you yes about requests for sure, but I'm not sure about responses library. So you're wondering if they have to match. That's right. I'm not sure about responses. I would have to check. But if it supports Unicode, they will work together. I'm sure about requests, not about responses. I'm sure.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks.